Big Shaq left the house, hoping to unwind after a tiring day. The city lived its usual life at night. Passers-by hurried along the sidewalks, cars rushed along the busy streets, and the sparse glow of streetlights only accentuated the dense darkness of the alleys. Everything seemed ordinary. But after a few steps he felt a strange sensation, as if he were being watched, as if the city were trying to tell him something. His footsteps slowed. The sounds of the world around him became muffled, as if someone had turned off the sound in a movie. His eyes slid involuntarily toward the narrow alley he usually avoided. The emptiness between the houses drew him in like a dark hole. Why there? He thought, feeling a chill run down his spine. He wanted to turn away, to quicken his steps, but his feet carried him to the place. His heart pounded when he heard a faint sound, something between a sob and a whisper. It was dark in the alley. Thick shadows shrouded everything around him, as if hiding something important, something that should not be seen. And yet he felt he could not leave. The anxiety in his chest grew stronger, as if an invisible force were pulling him forward. What's in there? The thought, tinged with a mixture of fear and curiosity, made him take another step. And then he saw her, a figure barely discernible in the dim light. A man? A woman? She sat on the ground, head lowered, arms wrapped around her rounded belly. There was a sense of heavy, overpowering darkness about her. Big Shaq froze. This wasn't just a walk. Something was telling him that this moment would change his life forever. Turning the corner, Big Shaq stopped as if he had run into an invisible wall. His gaze fell on a figure sitting on the ground. It was a woman, her whole posture screaming hopelessness. Head down, shoulders slumped, hands clasped around her rounded belly. Even from a distance he could feel her heavy presence. It was as if she were part of this abandoned alley, dark and cold. As he got closer, he noticed several crumpled bills scattered around her. The money lay as if forgotten or abandoned, not as a reward for labor or thanks for help. This was not a scene of a man asking for alms. It was a scene of someone given up. He froze for a moment, not knowing what to say. The woman suddenly raised her head, and their gazes met. Her eyes, they burned through him. They were the eyes of a man who had endured too much pain to hope. They told a story without words. A house burned to the ground. A lover who left her alone with a child, and endless days of struggling just to live to see tomorrow. Big Shaq's eyes lingered on her shaking hands for a moment. She held them as if she were trying to protect herself and her child from the world. But it was a cruel world. Her skinny body, tattered old cloak, and shoes that didn't fit properly told her that life had long since stopped sparing her. "Are you okay?" He squeezed out, not knowing why he asked. How could anyone be okay in this condition? The woman tried to answer, but her voice broke into a hoarse whisper. She raised her hand to her face as if trying to wipe away her tears, but there were too many. I just need some warmth," she whispered, choking back a sob. Big Shaq stepped closer, feeling the weight of her condition pressing down on him like a slab of concrete. Questions swirled in his mind. How did she end up here? Why hadn't anyone helped her? And what should he do now? He noticed that her legs were shaking and realized she was freezing. The cold night wind blew through her thin clothes, and he, wearing a warm jacket, felt a pang of guilt. He slowly removed his jacket and covered the woman with it. She looked up, surprised, almost in disbelief. "Thank you." She exhaled, and that single word sounded like she'd long ago forgotten how to say thank you. But her eyes gave away more than her words. They weren't asking for charity or pity. They were begging for something more, for salvation, for a second chance, for simple hope. In those few seconds, Big Shaq realized that he hadn't just met someone in trouble. He had encountered a real tragedy, and in that minute he realized he couldn't just leave here. Big Shaq stepped closer, and every step he took echoed in his head, as if the city was holding its breath, watching this moment. The woman didn't move, didn't take her eyes off the ground. Her breathing seemed to grow heavier, as if each breath hurt. Her body looked so fragile that he feared even a faint breeze might break her. She didn't say a word, not a plea, not a request for help. Only silence, oppressive and ominous, surrounded her. And that silence spoke more than any words. In her face, in her weary gaze, she could read her whole life. A hard journey filled with betrayal, loss, and fear. Big Shaq tried to speak again, his voice low, almost a whisper. "How can I help you?" She flinched faintly, as if his words were a sharp knife cutting through her insulation. But there was no response. Only her fingers clenched tighter, white against her dark skin, as if she were trying to hold on to the last drop of life she had left. His gaze fell to her stomach. It was noticeably rounded, but she was sitting as if she were trying to hide it, wrapping her arms around it, as if she were afraid someone might take that away too. Big Shaq felt a heavy feeling rise in his chest, a mixture of anger, fear, and pity. "Are you alone?" he asked again, realizing his voice sounded helpless. This time she nodded faintly. That movement, simple, almost machine-like, made his heart clench. She was alone, completely. No one around to support her, no one to give her a place to hide from the cold wind, no one to tell her everything would be okay. Big Shaq dropped to one knee, now at her level. He looked into her face, and what he saw struck him to the core. Her eyes. They were filled not only with tears but also with some inexplicable fear, a fear that could not be described in words. It was fear for her life, her own and that of her unborn child. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly, realizing that he was probably asking for too much to tell. She finally raised her head. Her lips trembled, but no words came out. Instead, her gaze traveled down his face as if she were trying to see if he could be trusted. On her neck, he noticed a bruise, old, almost healed, but still visible. Her arms, covered in scratches and scars, looked like she'd fought for her life more than once. Her eyes finally met his. There was so much pain in them that Big Shaq felt his breath catch. This wasn't just trouble. It was an abyss. The story she carried was so heavy that her silence seemed the only way to keep herself afloat somehow. In that moment, he realized that her pain was deeper than he could have imagined. She wasn't just asking for help, she was trying to survive. And now, in that silence, he felt the weight of her loss. "I'm here to help," he said finally, realizing that even those words sounded pathetic in the face of what she was facing. But he was sure of one thing. He couldn't leave her here, in this silence and darkness. With that thought, he realized that he was now part of her story, a story that was just beginning to unfold, revealing more and more tragedy. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but her voice did not come out at first. It was obvious that she was struggling to find the words that could explain everything that had happened to her. Her breathing was intermittent, and her hands continued to shake. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, hoarse, broken, as if each phrase caused her physical pain. "Yeah, I don't know where to start," she whispered, avoiding his gaze. "It all started a few months ago. I was working at a restaurant. It wasn't a dream, but it was a job that kept me afloat. Then I found out I was pregnant. I thought it would change everything, that we'd have a family, that he would be happy. She was silent, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Big Shaq waited, not daring to interrupt her. But he walked away, said he wasn't ready for it, that it was my problem. A few weeks later, I lost my job because my boss decided that a pregnant waitress was ruining the view. I had to look for a cheaper place to live, and I found a hole-in-the-wall room in an old house. It didn't even have proper heating, but I thought it was temporary. Her voice trembled and she fell silent, pressing her palm to her mouth as if trying to hold back tears. Big Shaq quietly said, "Take your time. Tell me when you're ready." She nodded slowly and spoke again, her voice even quieter. 2 months later, the house burned down. I barely had time to run out. I had nothing left, no belongings, no papers, no money. All I could save was myself and the baby. I don't even know how. She looked up and there was a fear and pain in her eyes that couldn't be faked. Everything went downhill after that. People always say they're willing to help, but when they see a pregnant woman without a home, they start looking at you like you're a leper. Why did you end up in this position in the first place? I heard, like it's my fault. Her voice shook again, and she gripped her stomach tighter. I slept in shelters, but there was no place for pregnant women. Everyone was as desperate as me, and sometimes even worse. I got scared. Then I ended up here on the street. I tried to ask for help, but no one would stop. They tossed coins like I was part of the decor of this street. No one even tried to talk to me, except for you. Big Shaq felt the pain clench in his chest. He looked at her and saw a person broken by circumstances but still clinging to hope. She didn't ask for money, didn't beg for pity. She just wanted to believe that there was someone in the world willing to listen to her, to understand her. "I don't need money," she continued, her voice growing more and more fragile. "I need help. I need hope. Just a little bit. Anything to help me get back on my feet again." Big Shaq felt everything inside him turn upside down. Those words, so simple, so desperate, pierced through him. He didn't know what to say. In that moment, he was overcome with a mixture of anger and helplessness. How could it be that a man who only a few months ago was living an ordinary life was in such a state? How could the world be so indifferent? But her eyes. There was still a spark in them, despite everything she'd been through. Barely visible, almost extinguished, but still there. She wanted to believe that life could change. And in that moment, Big Shaq realized that she trusted him more than anyone else. "We'll figure something out," he finally said, his voice sounding firm despite his inner doubts. He knew it wasn't just words. This had now become his business, his challenge, and he wasn't going to back down. Her face twitched, as if she wanted to smile but had forgotten how to do it. Instead, she said quietly, "Thank you. Thank you for at least listening." And in that second, under the dim light of the alley, Big Shaq made a promise to himself that this story would not end in tragedy. Big Shaq stood motionless, as if time had stood still. The night air was heavy, thick, pressing. In front of him was a woman whom the world had long ago rejected, but now she was looking at him with faint hope. That gaze penetrated him through and through. He felt that her last strength held only on the tiny, almost invisible chance that someone might finally be able to help. But what could he do? An inner voice, full of doubt, tried to break through his thoughts. "You're not a social worker. You're not a rich man. You're just an ordinary person." What can you offer? A few bills? A warm word? Will it change her life? He thought of all the people who'd probably walked past her before, the ones who'd probably left change and thought they'd done enough. His hands involuntarily reached into his pocket where his wallet was. He pulled it out and saw several bills. Leave them with her and go. You did what you could, his mind whispered, but his heart resisted. Every time he tried to take a step back, her image, that silent pain in her eyes, kept him from moving. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Helping her wasn't a quick gesture, not a one-time charity. It was a decision that could change not only her life, but his own. Are you really ready? That question kept him on his toes. The woman noticed his hesitation and lowered her gaze a little, as if she realized he might be leaving like the others. Her shoulders slumped even more, and she hugged her belly again, shielding the child from the cold wind. That gesture, so simple and instinctive, hit him harder than any word could. No, he thought. I can't just leave. Big Shaq took a step forward and squatted in front of her. His voice was firm, but inside he was struggling with doubt. Look, I don't know how to do this, but I'm not leaving you here. We'll find a solution. Together. She looked up, and something akin to surprise flashed in her eyes for a moment. Why do you want to help? She asked quietly, her voice full of disbelief. I just can't pretend it didn't happen, he answered honestly. It's not the right thing to do. You shouldn't be here alone. She shook her head, a shadow of doubt appearing on her face. You don't understand what this means. You have your own life, your own problems. Why do you want to take on mine? That question made him freeze. Why did he want to do this? There was no clear answer inside him. He just knew that if he left now, he could never forget her eyes, her shaking hands, that voice full of broken dignity. Because someone has to, and if not me, then who? He said at last, not knowing where the words had come from. Her face trembled. She looked at him as if she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she wasn't alone. But even in her gratitude, something else was evident. Fear. Fear that it might all be too good to be true. Big Shaq felt the weight of his choice. He knew that everything would change now. He could no longer go back to his normal life, simply forgetting this moment. From this moment on, he was part of her journey, her struggle. And, though he was afraid he might fail, he had one firm conviction inside him. It was worth a try, because nothing would change if no one took the first step. Slowly but surely, Big Shaq straightened up, gathering all his strength. He looked at her tears, at her trembling hands, at the faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. A storm of doubt and fear raged inside him, but the decision came suddenly, like a lightning strike. You're coming with me, he said firmly, holding out his hand to her. His voice was confident, but his heart was beating like it was trying to break through. We'll deal with this together. The woman looked up, her face frozen in surprise. She couldn't believe he had just said that. Are you serious? You don't even know me. How can you just take me with you like that? There was doubt in her voice, but a faint spark of faith shone through. Big Shaq smiled, trying to hide his own fears. Sometimes you don't need to know everything to change someone's life. Just believing is enough. She stared at his outstretched hand, as if afraid it were an illusion. But after a few moments that seemed like an eternity, she slowly placed her palm in his. It was a fragile gesture of trust, but it meant more than 1,000 words. They began walking down the street. the silence broken only by the sounds of the nighttime city. The woman walked slowly, tiredly, but there was a new strength in her steps. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she was not alone. But something was wrong. Big Shaq felt a tension hanging in the air, as if an invisible threat was watching them from the shadows. His gaze darted around, but he couldn't figure out where the sensation was coming from. And then he heard it. Footsteps, heavy, thudding, approaching from behind. He looked back and saw 3 men emerging from the darkness of the alley. Their stares were cold, piercing, and their gait was menacing. "Hey, you, hero," one of them said, tall and broad-shouldered, his voice drenched in contempt. "You think you can just take her and leave? We've been watching this lady for a long time. We have our own plans." The woman frantically grabbed Big Shaq's hand, her face contorted with fear again. "No, please don't," she whispered, as if she knew these people. Big Shaq tensed, his hands clenched into fists. "Look, leave us alone. She's not yours, and you're not getting anything from her." His voice was firm, but inside he felt a wave of adrenaline wash over him. The men laughed, their laughter rough and cruel. "You don't understand, boy," the second man said, pulling something out of his pocket. It was a knife. The blade gleamed in the dim light of the street lamp. "Let her go, or you'll regret it," Big Shaq said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. They began to approach. The woman, trembling, whispered, They're from the orphanage where I was. I left there because they... Her voice broke, but Big Shaq realized that these men were following her for a reason. The situation was heating up. Big Shaq looked around quickly, trying to figure out what to do. Run? But they wouldn't be able to run far. Fight? He had no weapons, and the risk was too great. But he knew one thing. He wouldn't leave her behind. He took a step forward, covering the woman with himself. "For the last time, leave us alone," he said, feeling every nerve in him tense to the limit. The men froze for a moment, looking at him as if assessing his resolve. Then the tall one grinned. "All right, but you got yourself into this for nothing, kid. You're in her shoes now." They turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a tense silence. Big Shaq didn't relax until they were completely gone. The woman collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "Thank you. Thank you," she repeated through her tears. Big Shaq lifted her up, helping her stand. "We're going to make it through this. I promise," he said, though inside he was still in shock. This night was just beginning, and he knew that her story was now part of his, and that the dangers along the way were just beginning. They walked through the night streets, lit by sparse street lights. The woman held on to Big Shaq's hand as tightly as if she was afraid that if she let go, the world would collapse on her again. He felt her trembling, heard her heavy breathing, and saw in her eyes a weariness that even silent gratitude for his presence could not hide. A small hotel illuminated by a bright neon sign came into view. Big Shaq stopped at the entrance and looked up at it. "We're here. You need to rest." She nodded, but her eyes were still full of anxiety. They went inside and Shaq walked up to the receptionist's desk. "I need a room, a single," he said, pulling out his card to pay. The receptionist glanced at the woman and then at Shaq, his expression hard to decipher. He nodded, handed over the keys and said, "Third floor, room 305. Big Shaq walked her to her room. She stopped on the threshold as if she couldn't bring herself to enter. Is this really for me?" Her voice trembled. "Yes, for you." "You should rest," he said, nudging her forward gently. When the door closed behind her, Shaq felt fatigue come over him, but he couldn't let himself relax. He quickly left and headed for the nearest convenience store, where he picked up food, water, warm clothes, and a first aid kit. Back at the hotel, he left everything at her door and knocked. The woman opened and froze, looking at the packages. You did this for me? You need this. Now go get some rest. We'll talk in the morning," he replied. She tried to say something again, but the words wouldn't come out. Her eyes filled with tears, and she said quietly, "Thank you." But Shaq knew this was only the beginning. In the morning, they had to find a safe place, perhaps a long-term home, to deal with her health and the future baby. He didn't know how he would handle it all, but he was sure he wouldn't stop. The morning came quickly. He met her in the hotel lobby. She looked a little better. Her face was fresh but still tired. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded. Their journey began at the nearest medical center. Shaq insisted that she be examined by a doctor. While they waited for the results, he noticed her hands shaking all the time. "Are you okay?" he asked. I'm just scared," she replied, lowering her eyes. "What if this whole thing, what if it won't last? What if everything falls apart again?" "Nothing's going to collapse," he said firmly. "We'll deal with it together, step by step." The doctor came out of the office, holding papers in his hands. His face was serious. "She is severely malnourished, anemic, and vitamin deficient. It's dangerous, especially late in pregnancy. She needs rest, nutrition, and constant observation." Those words pierced Shaq. He knew it was serious, but now he felt that every minute counted. He took her to the nearest cafe to feed her. The woman ate slowly, as if she was used to saving every bite. "Now, we need to find a place where you can be safe," he said, going over the options in his head. He remembered that he'd once heard of a charity organization that helped women in her situation. But when he called the organization, the response was cold. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any slots right now. We can put her on a waiting list." Shaq felt everything boiling inside him. How is this possible? How can someone who is on the verge of life and death be put in line? He hung up the phone and turned to her. "Don't worry, we'll find another place." But their search dragged on. Everywhere they went, they were turned down. There was no room, or they asked for documents she didn't have. Every no hit her harder and harder. She began to lose faith. Her eyes were empty again. "Shaq, why don't you just leave me here? I can handle it," she said quietly, but he stopped abruptly and looked at her. "I told you before, I won't leave you." His voice sounded firm, but in his heart he was full of anxiety. He knew that new trials awaited them, and in that moment he realized this wasn't just her ordeal, it was his too. Her faith in people was held on a thin thread, and he was the one who had to keep her from falling. There was a long road ahead, but Shaq wasn't about to give up. Big Shaq thought for a long time about what to do next. It was clear to him that going it alone would be incredibly difficult. The woman needed help right now, but her situation required resources and support that he couldn't provide alone. He pulled out his phone, opened his social media accounts, and started writing. "Friends, I have never asked for anything like this before, but today I met a person who desperately needs our help. She is a pregnant woman who has lost everything: her home, her job, her family. She is alone, undocumented, and unsupported, and she urgently needs a place where she can be safe. I know that together we can change her life. Any help is important. Money, clothes, housing, or just kind words. Let's show that we care. He hit publish and felt a wave of anxiety come over him. What if no one responded? What if his words drowned in a flood of other people's stories? But soon the phone began to vibrate. The first comments came almost immediately. "How can I help?" wrote one of the followers. "I have some children's things. I can give them to you," suggested another. Then a message from a friend. "Shaq, I have a spare room. You can bring her to my place." Big Shaq couldn't believe his eyes. People kept writing, sharing contacts, offering help. Some sent money to the card, others offered temporary accommodation. Even strangers from other cities offered their support. When he showed the woman the phone with the messages, she stared at the screen for a long time without saying a word. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't believe it's true," she whispered, trembling. "It's true," Shaq said, smiling. "You're not alone anymore. People care about you." From that moment on, things started to change. Shaq took her to his friend's house, who offered her temporary lodging. It was a small house on the outskirts of town, but it was warm and cozy. It had a bed, a clean bathroom, and even a kitchen where she could cook. "Stay here as long as you need to," the friend said, hugging her. At the same time, Shaq began collecting donations to help her with basic needs. People sent money, clothes, baby items, and even job offers. After a few days, he arranged with a charity organization to provide medical care for her. The woman began to change. She became a little more confident. Her eyes were no longer blank. She began to smile, albeit tentatively. I never realized that so many people could help me. Why do they do it?" Shaq looked at her and said, "Because good things always come back. And because you deserve it." But even at that moment, he knew that the struggle was not over. They still had a lot to do. Paperwork, finding a permanent place to live, getting her a job. Each step required effort, but now they were not alone. One evening, as Shaq was going through more messages for help, a woman approached him and, struggling to find the words, said, "Thank you. If it weren't for you, I probably would have given up. You didn't just help me. You gave me faith that I could live again." Those words touched him to the core. He realized that everything they had been through was not in vain. It was proof that the power of support and kindness can overcome even the darkest moments. But there was one more test ahead of them that was to be the ultimate test of that power. The woman's life began to change its course. Every morning, waking up in a clean, warm room, she couldn't believe it was real. The silence no longer pressed down on her, and the fear of each new day gradually receded. Instead came a calmness and confidence she had long forgotten. Big Shaq didn't disappear from her life after that night. He came almost every day, sometimes with bags of food, sometimes just to talk. She didn't see pity in his eyes, but a genuine concern that gave her back her strength. He joked, told stories, listened to her, and sometimes just sat by her side, silently supporting her. "I'll never forget that night," she said one day as they sat in the kitchen. Her voice was quiet, but there was a hardness in it. "You could have walked by like everyone else, but you stopped. Why?" Shaq hesitated, looking out the window. "Honestly, I don't. There's just something about you that told me I couldn't leave you. Sometimes life gives us a choice, and you either take the responsibility or you miss the chance to do something meaningful." Her eyes filled with tears. She quickly wiped them away, but smiled. "You gave me more than just help. You gave me back my faith in people." After a couple of weeks, thanks to Shaq's efforts and the support of his friends, she found a temporary job. A small position at a local bakery was not a dream, but a steady income. After hearing her story, the owner of the bakery offered her a flexible schedule so that she could attend doctor's appointments and prepare for the birth of her child. Every day after work, she came home with a tired but happy smile. Her hands were strong again and her eyes shone with life. Shaq noticed how she had changed. The broken woman he had met in the dark alley was different now. "I feel like I'm starting to live again," she once said, "but it's all because of you." "No, it's because of you," he objected. "You didn't give up. You took a step toward change. I just gave you a little push." Her health also began to improve. The doctors Shaq found through charitable organizations monitored her condition closely. She began to feel more confident and, most importantly, she knew her baby was safe. Shaq had become more than just a friend to her. He was the man who reminded her that she deserved better, that her life was important. He showed her that the world could be kinder than she thought. Every night, when she was alone, she thought back to the night when everything had changed. She remembered his words, his determination, his desire to help. She went back to that moment again and again when someone had seen her as more than just a problem and reached out to her. Now she knew her life would never be the same again. She had a chance to start over, and she was ready to fight for her future. This woman's story seemed to begin in a dark alley, but her real beginning came with the first step to a new life. When her story spread through Big Shaq's social media channels, it became more than just a story of distress and rescue. It was a story of hope, a story that proved that even in the darkest moments, light could be found. People who read about her struggle and Shaq's act responded at an incredible rate. Messages came from everywhere, from other cities, countries, even continents. Some said her strength inspired them to believe in the best. Others confessed that they had never thought about how small acts can change lives. Some wrote that they would now help people in difficult situations. Shaq himself was shocked at the magnitude of this reaction. He knew he was doing it for her, for the one life that needed saving. But what happened next exceeded his expectations. Inspired by this example, people began to share their stories of helping others. Some shared how they had fed a homeless person. Some offered housing to a single mother, and others simply began to look for ways to make a difference in the life of at least one person. The woman, when she learned of the scale of support, could not find words for a long time. Her voice trembled as she told Shaq, "You didn't just save me. You saved my faith in people. I couldn't even imagine that my story could mean something to someone else." Shaq only smiled. "It wasn't me. You're the one who inspired them. You are proof that goodness will always find a way." Her life continued to get better. Charities helped with paperwork, a company offered her a permanent job, and a family inspired by her story invited her to stay with them until she could get back on her feet. When the moment came, her baby was born in a safe and loving environment. She named him Isa, which meant gift. This story was not only her personal victory. It became a symbol that humanity is still alive, that one good deed can create a chain of others. People who previously thought they could not help began to believe that even a small gesture can change someone's world. Shaq, despite all the attention, remained humble. Whenever he was thanked, he would only say, "I just did what I had to do." It's not heroism, it's just life. But inside he knew he had done so much more. He became the link between the despair of one man and the kindness of hundreds. When her life finally found stability, the woman decided to do something no one expected. She began to help others as she had once been helped. She organized meetings with women in distress, shared her story, and listened to them wholeheartedly. She became an example of how you can rise from your knees, even when it seems like the whole world is against you. "Your act became my inspiration," she once told Shaq. "Now I want to be the person who helps others the way you helped me." The echo of this kindness spread far beyond their town. The story reached the news. It was discussed on forums and social networks. People were talking about it on the streets, inspired, finding the strength to help others, just to be a little kinder. And though Shaq and the woman went on their separate ways, they knew that their meeting was more than just a coincidence. It was a moment when the world showed that even in the darkest corners, light could be found. One person, one decision, one outstretched hand, and lives can change forever. The echoes of kindness continued to resound, proving that the world is a better place if we are willing to take even one step towards each other. Conclusions from this story. 1. Every action makes a difference. Even a small gesture of kindness can be the beginning of a big change. By stopping by that evening, Big Shaq proved that one person can make a difference in the life of another. 2. Faith in people can restore hope. A woman who has lost everything has regained her faith in kindness and humanity thanks to the support of Shaq and the people around her. 3. We are stronger together. When people came together to help, a real miracle happened. Community support, even from strangers, showed how powerful collective kindness can be. 4. Don't judge people by their situation. No one knows the whole story of a person in trouble. This woman did not need pity, she needed a chance. 5. Someone has to start first. Being the one who takes the first step is difficult, but it is actions like these that inspire others to do good deeds. 6. Kindness is contagious. This woman's story showed that one good deed can create a chain reaction, inspiring others to do good. 7. You don't have to be a hero to help. Shaq was not rich or powerful, but his genuine desire to help became a powerful tool for change. 8. Never give up hope. Even in the most difficult circumstances, life can change for the better if you have support and faith in a bright future. This story reminds us that the world changes when we show care, compassion, and a willingness to help. Each of us can be part of someone's story of salvation. This story is a reminder that even a small act can change someone's life. Share this video with your friends and family to inspire them to do good deeds. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more touching and inspiring stories. We want to know your stories of kindness too. Write in the comments what kind acts of kindness you have done in your life. Also, tell us where you're watching this video from. Let's show how kindness unites people from all over the world.